Welcome to Risk Roundup. Along with geospace, aquaspace, and space, cyberspace is a contested common, and its use as a battleground to wage war is rapidly intensifying. This changing landscape of warfare, where emerging cyber weapons have become more lethal than real battlefield weapons, is becoming a cause of great concern. Keeping up with the rapidly growing complexity of the raging war in cyberspace is a challenge facing not only nations' military, but also individuals and entities across nations, its government, industry, organizations, and academia. So, as we evaluate the ongoing cyber warfare getting integrated with artificial intelligence and its scope of overall entanglement with geospace, aquaspace, and space, the anonymity of enemy soldiers in the cyber domain, and the leveling of attack capabilities, we are entering an era where it seems a new paradigm of cyber conflict and warfare management seems essential. To discuss cyber warfare further, I'm delighted to welcome retired Colonel Dr. Don Welch to Risk Roundup. Dr. Welch is the Chief Information Security Officer and has just been, taken over the role of acting CIO and acting VP. I'm not sure if that is still current for Penn State.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Also an affiliate professor in the College of Information Science and Technology, as well as the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. Welcome, Dr. Welch. We are so honored to have you on Risk Roundup.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Wonderful, Dr. Welch. So it seems cyberspace is the only domain which is entirely human-made. And it seems to have been created, maintained, owned, and operated both by public as well as private stakeholders across nations. It is changing continuously in response to technology transformation and is not being subject to geopolitical or natural boundaries. So information and electronic payloads are deployed instantaneously between any point of origin and any destination connected through the electromagnetic spectrum, and data and information travel in the form of multiple digitalized, fragmented, through unpredictable routings before being reconstituted at their destination. So as we evaluate this man-made contested common, how is cyber warfare evolving as compared to warfare in geospace, aquaspace, and space, which commonly known as land, sea, air, and space?
Yeah, so I think you're right in that the lines between the battlefield and non-battlefield are really blurred. So as we've always had terrorism, but terrorism has gotten more popular as time has gone on, and who is a combatant and who is not have gotten a little bit more difficult to understand. And I think that what's going on in cyberspace is an extension of that trend. So, for example, in the United States, the Constitution precludes the federal government from taking action inside the U.S. borders, especially the military aspects, so the NSA, the CIA, and of course the armed services. So most of the attacks that go on in cyberspace are going on within the U.S. borders. And so it leaves people like the security teams and the IT teams at institutions like Penn State to actually be combatants. And we really, I think, have to go back to the colonial days when there was not a strong federal government in the U.S. and defending settlements and colonies fell on the colonists themselves. So this is really a little different way for us to act. There are certainly a lot of constitutional issues about when we can invite the federal government in, how much it can do, how much it should do, and to be able to defend our nation's critical infrastructure. And as you pointed out, it's more than just stealing intellectual property. It can be a life safety issue now. And then to continue to go on this introductory first question, as you pointed out, the combatants are more and more wired. The soldiers themselves are carrying, many computers. All our vehicles are many computers. Back when I was in the Army, we talked about the next infantry rifle was going to have 20 million lines of code in it. The project managers for major weapon systems, they'd show you a picture of a mobile artillery piece and say, "What is this?" And people would say, "Oh, that's artillery. It's a cannon." It's like, no, it is a container for software. That software is what makes this weapon effective. And so that also is having that effect that traditionally non-combatants can have an impact on the battlefield, conducting cyber operations against the uniformed military. So that border has really changed, and it's blurred, and it's really difficult to draw lines when we like to draw those lines.
Yes, that is very true, and there is, complexity of the technology transformation, because there is so much progress and development in technologies, and every day technology changes. And this, the hacking industry itself is now an industry. It's a blown industry, so that creates so much complex challenges, and there is this vicious power struggle, raging on in the cyberspace, and this new cyber battleground is full of unknowns, because there are so many significant players and minor players, and rules of war and reasons for war are not understood clearly. In this cyber battlefields, the war casualties have been quietly piling up, and it seems everyone, that is, individuals and entities across nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia, are being hit and are at risk of being hit. No one is being spared, including common citizens. So that brings us a question, that how can anyone be prepared for this new warfare reality? Because not everyone has understanding of the computers or the security technologies or processes, and most of the common citizens, they are not prepared with this kind of vulnerabilities. And if they are not prepared, and everything is interconnected, because now internet is connecting not only just the major corporations, but even the homes and enterprises, and everything is getting connected. So how can any nation, or how should any nation, prepare for this new warfare reality?
So I think that, like any complex problem, there are complex answers to it. So it's many faceted on how we'll have to do that. And I think the same kinds of things that are necessary to combat cybercrime are the things that are necessary to combat cyber war. Obviously, nation states and non-governmental bad actors, the terrorist organizations, and so forth, can bring a lot of technology and expertise to bear, but still, your basic citizens have got to learn how to operate in this more adversarial internet that continues to grow. Things like keeping your systems patched, having some basic awareness of security, and so forth. When we started driving cars, it was a new technology, and we needed to figure out basic things like which side of the road we would drive on, what are the rules for intersections, and so forth. And people had to become aware of that. And right now, those kinds of things are second nature to us. And I think in using technology, guarding our security, our privacy, that's going to have to be second nature. And it's certainly not yet. Obviously, I work at a university, and I'm around students. I have young children of my own who know a lot about technology, but are not as concerned about their privacy as I think they should be. And the question is whether that even matters, that all of our privacy is already compromised anyway, and you will never get that information back. But regardless of all that, we need this awareness overall. And of course, one of my concerns is small businesses. So if a country is going to attack and try to either combine a traditional kinetic type of attack with cyber operations, then they can go after big companies. Big companies have resources. Most of them do a fairly good job of securing their critical infrastructure. But if you want to disrupt, say, the food supply for a region, yes, you could go after the big distribution companies, but you can make a big impact by hitting a number of smaller companies that are probably not well prepared. Cybersecurity people are expensive. Running your infrastructure well so that it's not vulnerable is expensive, and a lot of small companies have difficulty coming up with the resources to do IT well. And also just the practical sense of it. If your IT shop is 3 people, you can't afford a full-time security person. So someone is doing it part-time. They're not going to be as good at understanding what the threats and what the countermeasures are and so forth. So I think one of the challenges, how are we going to defend those small companies that, if attacked in aggregate, can have the same impact as taking down a major company that's a major infrastructure provider like transportation or food distribution or whatever it may be that supports that operation. And then, of course, different than cyber operations, there's information operations. And of course, we see that in social media right now. And of course, they're not the same thing, but they complement each other. We have to understand as a people what those informations are, who's trying to manipulate our perceptions and our actions, and be able to live in a world where we can understand that.
Yes.
Many, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. That we do need to understand that how the misinformation, disinformation campaign is going on, and like you said, the nature of privacy. While the young children, a young generation is not concerned about it, and it seems that the nature of privacy itself is changing nature and definition. But you're absolutely right about individuals and small enterprises that they do not have enough resources. So what can be done? Not everyone has the resources like large corporations. So probably we need to start focus on how we can have the manufacturers and telecom companies to incorporate the first layer of security in them. Because right now, if you buy any computer or any phone, it doesn't come with any security. So we have to install all the antivirus and all those kind of softwares, and not everyone is knowledgeable. So why not just make manufacturers install all that and have regular updates, so that will take away the some vulnerability. And the second thing is telecommunication. That also can be the first layer, because everything comes through wireline and wireless networks. So why not have them incorporate a layer of security? So we have to change our approach, and that certainly is possible if everyone works together and understand that these risks that are emerging and coming our way are very, very complex, and we cannot have just one security solution. We need to have a layered security solution. So I mean, the rapidly transforming cyber battleground is bringing all of us, the good, the bad, and the unknown. And with the world getting immersed in these rapid advances in artificial intelligence, machine learning, it's making cyberspace and cybersecurity challenges very complex. So while the fundamental reason and goals of warfare have not changed, the way wars are fought indeed have. And is it fair to say that cybercrime or warfare activities through cyberspace is now the most critical national security threat, and perhaps ahead of terrorism, espionage, and weapons of mass destruction?
Well, so yeah, interesting question. Still, obviously, even though cyber weapons can kill and arguably may have caused some death, still it's fairly minor. A nuclear weapon obviously would be much more devastating. So I think, in reality, we're much more concerned about nuclear warfare, large-scale kinetic warfare. We're very good at blowing each other up at large scale, and we haven't seen that yet. So I wouldn't say that it is the major national security threat that we've got going on right now, but it's certainly one that we have to pay attention to. So if you look at the impact, the number of people who, for example, in the U.S. that have died due to terrorist attacks is still fairly minor compared to the number of people who have died in automobile accidents. But the impact is much greater. I like the example of about 10 times as many people worldwide are killed by cows as are killed by sharks. But nobody sees a cow and goes running away screaming cow, cow, and that. So it's the psychological impact is there. And I think the that cyber warfare has that capability right now, that we depend on it. If somebody cuts off the power, like I was working with the National Guard in the state of Michigan as we were developing cyber defenses for the state, and the National Guard commander, his number one worry was the power gets shut off in Michigan in January, and how is he going to keep all those people warm? Get them to a shelter where they could be protected from the cold. Those fears, I think, are real, and I think right now the thing that's holding that back is deterrence. So, what would a country do if they were attacked through a cyber attack that harms people? And there's been threats back and forth. We think we've seen a case where the Israelis bombed a Hamas center that was conducting cyber operations against them. There's been news reports of the U.S. penetrating the Russian utility system, power system, to deter the Russians who have allegedly penetrated the U.S. utility system. There have been reports that the Iranians tried to penetrate the U.S. utility systems and have done so that they could deter another Stuxnet-like attack. So once again, like nuclear warfare, right now it's all at that deterrence stage, and that may or may not work. It certainly worked for nuclear weapons, but how long will that work for cyber weapons? And I think we see our adversaries getting bolder. It's a complicated problem, and it's difficult for our leaders to figure out how to operate. When I was in the Army back around 2000, a cyber attack had the same release level as a nuclear weapon. If the Army was going to do a cyber attack, it had to have the presidential approval to do so. Now that's not the case. That's probably a good decision, but still I think breaking that deterrence is something that should not be done lightly, and I don't think will be done lightly on anybody's part right now.
Yes, I agree with you, and you are right that we still don't see widespread attack on humans to kill them. So that is still a relief that all these hackers and criminals are still having little conscience not to go after the humans to try to distort them. But we are not just facing challenges with the cyber weapons. We are also looking at these rapidly evolving EMP weapons, because electromagnetic weapons are also emerging. So, and there are many nations who would like to harm nations that are economically more successful. And that's where, United States, becomes very vulnerable, because billions of dollars are invested in developing cyber capabilities to attack financially successful nations like United States. So if bad actors succeed in attacking economically prosperous nations like United States, it will bring a collapse of global economy due to heavy dependence on on the other economies. So how to prevent damage to this global economy, and how to contain the cyber warfare ambitions of these bad actors, and especially the thousands and probably hundreds of thousands of young brilliant people who are getting attracted to move towards this the dark side and try to create damage because it's a thrill for them. So how to prevent that? Because that is where the biggest challenge is. If they don't have the bigger brain power, then it will be much easier for us to control the situation. But it looks like that a lot of young people are moving towards that.
Yeah. So, and vice versa. There's a lot of people who start out penetrating systems who become professionals in the security field and want to stop those malicious actions. So I think we're always going to have people who who have bad motivations. I mean, I think that's human nature. Just like we're not going to stop terrorists from being recruited, but what we want to do is mitigate their impact. So one of the things I think you brought up earlier in that the devices that we buy, those are not necessarily secure. Well, how do we make them that way? Do we regulate that and say, oh, it must be secure? Well, regulation can be effective, but it's certainly not the most effective. The most effective would be if the marketplace said, we want secure devices, and people were willing to pay for it. Because for software to be secure, you don't just write it so it works, you have to write it so it doesn't fail. And we try to write software that controls aircraft so that it doesn't fail, or controls spacecraft so it doesn't fail. And that is much more expensive than it is to write consumer software that is just supposed to work. And so if we were willing to pay that, for example, the baby monitor that we use to watch or to keep an eye on our child, would we be willing to pay 10 or 20 times as much for it? But it would be secure because that company that did it would have put the effort in to do thorough testing, to design security in from the beginning, to pay those security professionals, and to keep that software updated when flaws are noticed. Right now there isn't a market for that. You'd go out of business. Even in the medical device field, we know that is a big problem. And I had been a consultant to a company that was going to be a startup to create secure medical devices, and they were going to build their own operating system from the ground up that would just handle those medical devices, but would be secure because it wasn't built to do other things, therefore not as complex and not as many flaws. But it didn't work. The market wasn't there, even in that, which is a life safety device. So that's what we really have to do is we need this widespread understanding so that people are willing to pay for it. And I'll give the example of an automobile. So the automobiles, when I was a child, are much more expensive now than they were then, even when you account for inflation. But they are much safer. Not only do they have seat belts, but they have airbags. They're built better, and so forth. And we have a combination of regulation and market. We have automobiles that are much safer now than they were 40 or 50 years ago. We need to get there faster with software, but consumers have to be educated too why it's necessary. And unfortunately, that education probably involves a lot of pain and loss along the way. That's just human nature. That's the way we are.
Yes, that is an excellent point because education and awareness is the key, and that's what we at Risk Group are, trying to do one step at a time. That we educate global citizens, not just in the United States, but everybody across nations to understand the risks so that they can take an informed decision about what needs to be there and they can support the right initiatives. Now, it's not just the cyber weapons we are talking about. We see AI and machine learning capabilities beginning to be incorporated and integrated into cyber warfare. So how will the malicious code that includes AI and machine learning capabilities change the cyber warfare landscape? What trends do you see?
Well, so you're right. We're starting to see malicious software that is controlled by artificial intelligence. I'm not sure we've really seen the wild yet in machine learning, but I'm sure that's coming. But also, we need artificial intelligence in defense, right? So people are going to they have to focus on the things that they're good at, which is, really difficult problems and thinking through those solutions, but they aren't good at reacting quickly and properly. So whenever we can automate a process, and if we happen to use artificial intelligence as part of that automation, then we will have a better response. But the important thing is machines can do processes that we can define much faster than people can. And so including that is going to be absolutely key. So we see the speed, when we talked about the advanced persistent threat years ago, and the idea that an adversary, especially a nation state, would come in, penetrate a network, take their time, move around, and be in that network for a long time, stealing what they can. That still is a threat, but we also see these attacks that are automated, smash and grab, if you will, where they go and they're not worried about being discovered. They want to quickly hit the payload, exfiltrate the data, or do whatever malicious things that they want to do, but do it faster than the defensive team can react. And that's where we need automation to be able to do. And AI is certainly one of that. AI, of course, is an important buzzword, as is machine learning. Machine learning is actually a little different, but AI to me is a programming technique. How do we put the process and logic in there? And artificial intelligence is a different way of doing it, that we can capture more complex processes, but it's very effective. Not necessarily are we at Skynet and the Terminator yet, but still effective programming techniques, and especially in attack and in defense.
Absolutely. And we are almost seeing an algorithmic warfare, and these algorithms are transparent. And who develops the algorithm, where it is developed, there is no way to know that. So there is no way to control. That's what, we just addressed in risk group, that, we need to create some sort of algorithm naming and identification system, so that once it becomes a security threat, then we do need to know what that algorithm is, so we can track it and we can contain it. But there needs to be some sort of naming and identification system of algorithms, because right now we have no idea who is, developing algorithms, where they are developed, and for what purpose. So that is where the bigger challenge is, because they are all transparent, and we will never know, what is included with the hardware that we are buying or software we are buying, because we have no capability to see that what algorithmic code is, embedded in that, and what is the purpose and goal of that. Now, the blurring boundaries of cyberspace and all these different spaces, aquaspace, geospace, and space, and growing threats from cyberspace means that the current and emerging warfare challenges will need to be fought using more tools than those furnished by the conventional military. And you recently proposed to create a cyber militia. Would that meet the needs of individuals and entity across nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia?
So I think the idea of a cyber militia is one way that we can do it. And the idea being that these people are well trained. And right now we've got some government programs in the US that are supporting that. I was involved in the state of Michigan. They had a National Guard unit, and they had what they called the cyber, I forget what it is, the Cyber Corps, the civilian Cyber Corps. So the state would provide training and provided them an organization to share best practices. They got, because they were trusted and had been checked, their backgrounds checked and so forth before they were brought into the system, they would have access to more threat intelligence through the Fusion Center. And that, I think, was a really far-reaching and a good start towards the kinds of things that we need. But the idea that individual organizations will fight this alone, I think, is a losing proposition. That we have to be able to share threat intelligence quickly. We have to share best practices. We have to work together. And there are a lot of different organizations and people who are working towards that end. The ones that work will be the ones we put more resources into, but you probably have heard of the Cyber Threat Alliance, security vendors who are sharing threat information with each other so that they can protect their customers faster, I think is a great idea. So that militia won't look like people with muskets and tricolor hats as it was back in our colonial days, but it will look like a very different thing, that is vendors and security people. Higher education is a nice environment that we don't really compete with each other. We don't, yes, we compete for students and research grants, but the collaboration is really high. I can talk to CISOs from especially other Big Ten universities. We meet 3 times a year. We talk on the phone every month, and we trust each other and keep each other up to date. And those kind of relationships are going to be really important. In the U.S., the FBI's InfraGard tries to foster those relationships regionally, and we're gonna need more of that to work together. One of the things that you mentioned, and you mentioned earlier, is the idea of not knowing what's in our software, and the idea of the supply chain security, and that really is a big deal. And you see the world wrestling with that now with Huawei. So 5G is coming, and it's going to be critical. And we are going to, the idea that just cell phones are on it is going to be gone. We're going to have cars, and we're going to have devices. And so we're going to have all these life safety systems on this network. And the Five Eyes intelligence agencies have questioned whether we could trust that supply chain. And code is so complex. You've seen some arguments of some people trying to figure out whether or not code has backdoors in it, or it just has a lot of security flaws, so forth. But the way we currently operate, we can't say that it is. And it might not even be the company that is necessarily being malicious, but if people infiltrate the company, they can put malicious code inside of a product. And we find cases of malicious software being found on consumer devices and phones and so forth. We find it in the Play Store, and all those different kinds of ways that malicious software finds itself into the supply chain. So much software now is built from open source, coming from GitHub and so forth, that people depend on it. It's expensive to go and examine all that code and understand the security implications of it. Generally speaking, people aren't incentivized to do that. And so therefore, they're not doing that. And we can't trust that supply chain. So it's going to require a huge effort across many areas where we can operate safely in cyberspace. The Russians and the Chinese are doing their best to be able to disconnect themselves from the internet. Maybe the idea of one internet for the entire world was a quaint idea that historians will look back at and say, yeah, it worked for 50 years, but after that, there will be closely monitored entrance and exit points, and the idea of the free and open internet will go away. I don't know, but certainly the way it's designed right now, it's very difficult to secure it. And I think we will see other developments of other types of networks that can be secured.
Yes, very true. No, there are complex challenges, and there are, trends emerging, which tells us that, maybe China will, cut off and, have their own internet. But the challenge is that even if nations cut off their internet and have the internal, network, but the companies are, not just in one location. They have, their presence in so many different locations. They're all transnational. So how do we, contain the security risk that emerges? And the point that you made about sharing threat intelligence, it's absolutely essential. But because of legal liability, corporations are not doing that. So what we at Risk Group, proposed is that we need to develop a framework that is security-centric risk management framework that would make every organization accountable for the security risk that emerges. Now, if the security risks are something of a nature that, just causes independent risk to their corporation and it falls within their corporation boundaries, then they are supposed to manage that. And if there is a chance that those security risks are going to cross their corporate boundaries and impact other corporations or their industry or other industries, then they become interconnected, interdependent, and they are accountable to share that information. Because without sharing the information of interconnected risk, we are just making the risk bigger and bigger, and we are facing huge complex challenges because of that. So we need to bring accountability in the security infrastructure, and we need to create that framework which gives an ability to everyone to share the information that they need to share. Now there is other framework that we have proposed, is that if we are going to remain in one internet, then we do need to come up with a global framework in which we need to identify risk, similarly independent risk and interdependent risk. And if the risk falls within a country, let's say China, then if it impacts only China, then it will remain within their walls, and they will have responsibility and opportunity to manage those risks. But if it's going to impact other countries, then they need to notify, that they need to share that information. So we have to make everyone accountable, and unless we develop a framework, that is not going to be possible. Just telling everyone that you should share information, they are not going to do that unless the legal liability, because we have to incorporate the accountability and legal liability into the framework, and that is something we all have to think about it, because without doing all those things, it is not going to be possible to manage the complex interconnected security risks that are coming our way. Any organization, they have a right to manage their independent risk the way they want to, but as soon as it becomes interconnected, then they have the accountability and responsibility and legal responsibility that they have to share that information. But that is a topic, huge topic to be discussed in a separate risk roundup. But let's talk about the law of armed conflict. Under the law of armed conflict, cyber warfare must be distinguished from phenomena such as cyber criminality. Is that distinction clear? When does a security breach or attack becomes a warfare event? And how are cyber conflicts evaluated currently, and who is evaluating them? Because we need some markers that tells us that this is not just a cyber terrorism, or this is not just a cyber criminal event, or cyber kidnapping, or cyber, all kinds of different nomenclature, but that it has become a warfare event. So what are the markers that tells us that this has become a warfare event now?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And the difficulty of attribution in cyber attacks complicates that even more, whether it's a criminal or a nation state, determining in which nation state. So when does it cross the border into warfare? So you can look at the intellectual property loss to China over the last decade or so, and can you say, well, if they had a bunch of spies that were over in the U.S. and they stole all this paper and brought it back, would that cross the threshold of war? Would we be justified to respond by sending warships over to China to do that? That's a question that I don't know. If you look at the Russian interference in the U.S. election and European elections over the last few years, did that cross the threshold? You can look at and say, well, how effective were the Russians in either promoting Brexit or the election of President Trump? And you look at the amount of ads they bought or whatever and say, boy, our campaign teams really have to get with it if they could influence an election with only spending that much money. When ours spent, hundreds of millions of dollars more and were ineffective. So it's a really good question. I think, like with elections, if we saw an attack where a foreign nation actually manipulated the voting results, I think most people would agree they'd probably cross the threshold. In the information operations, clearly, we've made a lot of threats, but we haven't attacked Russia. We've put sanctions on, but we haven't kinetically attacked them. We don't think that necessarily crossed the threshold. And I think at this point, you can't draw bright lines. You have to take the whole thing in complex. If you cross the threshold from a cyber war to kinetic war, there are real the implications from that are huge, right? When we're talking armed conflict, and we never want to go into armed conflict lightly because both sides are going to lose. Even the winning side is going to suffer from doing that. So I think it's good of our world leaders to be restrained before you go there. But we've got basically four elements of national power: diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And military should always be the last resort. And I think what we really need to do is you talk about a framework so that we understand this. And I know most nations have got policy people who are trying to determine this and make recommendations. Well, what's the appropriate response? Is it diplomatic? Is it information, a counter information operation? Is it sanctions? What can we do, and can we affect change or deter them from taking that action in ways that are short of kinetic warfare? And certainly we want to do that, but I think when we don't take appropriate action, then people are inspired to be bolder. And so we have to hope that we've got the right leaders who are making the right decisions, and they've got the right advice so that they can deter that activity, but not make the consequences so light that it encourages other nations to continue their attacks. And so, really hard, I think, to draw a bright line. It took us a long time to come up with the various conventions on land warfare, and even those, were not always followed. But generally, okay, it worked pretty well. But those are hard frameworks to come up with, and I think it's far more complicated than our current battlefields are to develop those frameworks. So right now, I think we have to depend on our nation, all the leaders of the world, to exercise the right judgment and how to respond and how to deter.
Yes, very true. I mean, I have been talking about that integrated security-centric risk management framework for last 3 years, and still now it's not going anywhere. So you are right; it's not an easy, a solution. You need to make sure that right people come on board, and decision makers understand the criticality of developing that. I'm proposing that, I'm discussing that with so many decision makers, but let's see where it goes. But other question I have is that, do nations have sovereignty in cyberspace for judging the lawfulness of cyber activity? Is there a legal framework regulating these warfare attacks?
So I think most countries will say that they have sovereignty, that they can control. So if you are a visitor in China and you do something that's illegal online, they have no problem arresting you and you suffering the consequences. The practicality of it is, we have indicted Chinese nationals for cyber attacks in the U.S. and Iranian nationals, Russians, and sometimes we catch them, but usually if they don't travel to a country that has an extradition treaty with the U.S., they are never going to face any punishment. So in a practical sense, that sovereignty is pretty thin. But the idea that you control your aspect of cyberspace, I think there's some good ideas behind that, right? So a lot of activity that happens in cyberspace, countries want to enforce their own values there. And is that okay? Well, we might not agree that we think you should have freedom to information or whatever, but I think that's an issue to handle in totality and not just in cyberspace. Whether North Koreans should have access to information through the network or whatever, if our countries decide that they should deal with it, that's something to be taken in totality. But in cyberspace, we came up with this idea that the internet would be free and open, and we're finding that, well, there's problems with that. Do we want, jihadists to be able to recruit over the internet? Well, we prefer they not. Well, okay, do we want child pornographers to be able to ply their trade? No, we don't. Well, okay, where do we draw the line? And nations need, I think, to be able to do that, because enforcement is essentially got to take place in the real world and not necessarily online. So I think that idea of sovereignty is there to stay for a while, and it really, like what we see with China, basically trying to really control their internet and control access to information inside their country. That's a trend that we might have that continues, and we may see that even in liberal democracies where we don't like what's going on in the rest of the internet and we try to control it. Realistically, it's not going to happen anytime soon. It's far too complex. Too much infrastructure is built out, and I don't think we'd put the effort towards it. But maybe 20 years in the future, that's where we'll be going.
It seems so. I agree with you on that. Now, when we consider, for example, any crippling or an effect of cyber operation that can disable entire systems, for example, electrical power grids or telecommunication infrastructure or any other critical infrastructure, the entire or say air defense system for any nation's military, then the magnitude of the impact falls within the realm of warfare. I mean, that is warfare if the critical infrastructure is attacked. So what are the legal framework guidelines for such scenarios if there is a system-wide attack, financial system, telecommunication system, military air system, or electrical power grids? How do nations go forward with warfare on that? Is there any legal framework guidelines for such scenarios?
So theoretically, in warfare, you are not supposed to target civilian only, civilian only use, right? So, but I think the way the interpretation of the laws of land warfare have evolved, if you attack the power grid that is supplying a factory that is making weapons, well, that's okay. The strategic bombing programs of World War II and so forth, and as long as you try and minimize collateral damage to non-combatants. But the idea that you can attack the entire industrial base that supports the war effort is, in the concept of proportionality is critical there. In terms of responses, that we have proportional response or we use whatever to minimize the collateral damage to non-combatants. So I think, once again, that it's nice to have a framework, and I think the current laws of land warfare are the best we have right now as we evolve that. But we've got all those four aspects of national power. And I think the principles that we want to deter further aggression or aggression in the first place, using those instruments of national power, I think is critical. And keeping it at a minimum is minimum level as possible, and a proportional level is possible. If a country can only respond with nuclear weapons, and so it's either nothing or everything, then that's a bad situation. So being able to impose sanctions, being able to have countries work together to impose sanctions so that they can be even more effective, that's the kind of thing that I think we need to continue to be able to do. It's the things that we've already been trying to do to deter aggression in kinetic space. So I think there's more of that, but I am reluctant right now for us to try and draw bright lines. And I think the reality is that most of our policymakers have a thin grasp of the technology. They have been working in it. They haven't necessarily grown up with an understanding of it. I've spent a lot of time working with military leaders and politicians and trying to explain this, and they want to take what they understand about the kinetic world, use it as an analogy for for cyberspace, and it's not quite the same thing. And so I think until we get leaders and advisors who have a better grounding in the technology and can keep up with the rapid changes, that it's going to be difficult to come up with an effective policy. I don't pretend that I can come up with them. I'm, at the point where I will throw my opinion in, but it takes a lot of smart people working really hard, I think, to work together to figure this out and try and come up with a framework where we can continue to thrive as a world. And of course, the easy solution is if we all got along better, it wouldn't be such a threat. But probably not going to happen in my lifetime. But it is, I think, important that we keep those diplomatic relationships open, try and keep those economic ties, try and understand each other, and basically reduce those reasons for conducting cyber war.
Very true, very true. I mean, that the bottom of all these problems is that we all are still working in silos. There is a need for collective approach, like you said, that we all need to, not one single person or organization can, come up with the effective policy, approach to policy or recommendations, but we have to work together and understand, bits and pieces that we can take from everyone and make it a very secure framework or, very effective regulations, which is becoming very difficult day by day because the technology transformation is so rapid. So to come up with an effective regulation in a timely manner is looking, very complex. But it is possible to work together, like you said, and come up with effective ways so that we can if we all work together across nations, then we can work on the real challenges facing the future of humanity, because there are a lot more complex challenges coming our way where we need to focus our attention, and we don't need to waste our energy on this useless and unnecessary warfare that is happening in cyberspace, because we, at the end of the day, if we cannot secure the future of humanity, then none of these matters. So having said that, how would you like to conclude the state of cyber warfare today, and what would you like to tell our global viewers and listeners, especially the young, brilliant minds who are getting so, caught up into getting into the cyber hacking and, doing all the crimes? What would you like to tell them?
Well, I think warfare, we used to say, in the infantry, is, seconds of sheer terror, punctuated by hours of boredom. And being on the defense can seem very boring, very tedious. Unlike on TV, it doesn't look that exciting. But the real hard, productive work, security work, is rewarding in that we are protecting our digital way of life and our way of life. So we value our liberal societies where we respect human rights, respect the rights of all sexes, ethnicities, and so forth. And that's something that is worth protecting, as well as our economic well-being. And so for people to go into that field, work hard, put their talent and their intellect towards defending this and making it a safe way where we can do the great things that the internet has opened up for us and make the world a better place. That may not be as rewarding minute by minute, but in the long term, I think it's something you can be very proud of.
Yes, very true. Very true. I mean, it has given us a lot of benefits and the tools necessary to connect with everyone across nations and do collaborative work, and come up with sharing, frameworks and infrastructure. So that is a great blessing. Only thing is, we have also given tools to these, wannabe criminals who want to destroy society. I mean, if they can focus their efforts and energy into managing the complex security risk coming towards the future of humanity, that would be more, effective and efficient way of using their brilliance and their energy levels. But having said that, thank you so much, Dr. Welch, for participating in this roundup today. We appreciate your thoughtful insight on cyber warfare, and our global viewers and listeners would benefit tremendously from the information you provided today and helping raise awareness of this critical topic. We thank you for that.
Thank you for having me on, Jayshree.
Wonderful, Dr. Wells. So, Risk Roundup, a global initiative launched by Risk Group, is a security risk reporting for risk emerging from existing and emerging technologies, technology convergence, and transformation happening across cyberspace, aquaspace, geospace, and space. We at Risk Group believe that risk management, security, and peace, they walk together hand in hand. Though security is related to management of threats and peace to the management of conflict, risk management is related to management of security vulnerabilities as well as management of conflict. It is not possible to conceive any one of the three without the existence of the other two. All three concepts feed into each other. We believe that the security we build for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secure for everyone across nations. Tradition becomes our security. So, if we build a culture of managing risk effectively, it will lead us to security, and security will lead us to peace. Let's manage the existing and emerging risks together. For more information on the risk roundups, to watch the risk roundup video audio podcast, please go to riskgroupllc.com and do not forget to subscribe and share. Until next time, I'm Jayashree, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time. Thank you.